Gentleman from Kansas, and now yield 5 minutes to my fellow Texan, Mr. Chip Roy.
Thank the chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here today. I know there's been a lot of back and forth about revenue side, differences of opinion about corporate tax rate, 15%, 20x% higher, how that compares to pass-through rates, subchapter S. Fine. Why don't we just concede and stipulate that we could continue to work to improve the tax code to adjust those rates one way or the other? We could have that debate. But at the end of the day, true or false was and I would ask this question, I don't know, maybe Mr. Taylor or Mr. Hodge. This last year was our overall tax revenue brought into the Treasury as a percentage of GDP at a relative historic high, at 19.6%, close to 20%. Are we not talking about a relative historic high for our nation in terms of revenues as a percentage of economic output? Right. So what we're talking about here when we hear a question, and Mr. Walker, you just speculated, and I agree with what you're saying on energy and other issues, saying, well, we're going to have more revenue. And I think what I'm assuming and what you're saying is we got to have more revenue if we're going to continue to spend at the levels we're spending, and that you're arguing that we're going to have to spend at those levels because of mandatory spending that we owe, and that we continue to grow discretionary spending, whatever that might be. So therefore, you're going to need more revenue if you want to make that math work. But I think it's really important for the American people to understand, and I just want to double down on this, that for the record, for the American people to understand, we're at 19.6%, almost 20% of relative amount of inflow revenue to the Treasury as a percentage of GDP, and we have, for the most part, give or take a few decimal points, never been higher than that. Post-World War II, at the beginning of our country now. True or false? I just want to make sure we're agreement on that.
One time, 2000 was the peak. We were over 20% of GDP.
But just slightly, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Say that again, Mr. Taylor. I'm sorry, Mr.
That was an accident in 2000 because of it was the internet bubble, drove up capital gains rates and so forth. So right. It was pure accident.
Right. So to the point, though, being at the relative level, 20%, with that and agreed that there was a spike there at the end of the dot-com boom in the 90s where that all kind of collided, and we were able to get to a point there where we obviously had zero deficit, right? The reason that is so critical is because everything we're talking about here, we're talking about revenue side, we have got to maintain economic growth, right? You guys have talked about that. Nothing we're talking about here, zero, will do anything relative to economic growth. Would you all agree that in order to solve our debt crisis at the moment, and we have a debt crisis, that economic growth is certainly the key driver to our ability to get out of it? Sort of post-World War II example. Go ahead, Mr. Walker.
We ought to focus on debt to GDP. That's what matters, not balanced budgets, debt to GDP. So you grow the denominator faster than the numerator, okay? And by the way, that was the #1 principle that a supermajority, over 90% of registered voters agreed to.
But if I can get to the point, though, on economic growth, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Hodge, do you agree economic growth is the key driver for our ability to get out of the debt crisis we're in now?
Absolutely. That's in my written testimony, oral testimony. It's so important.
In order to achieve economic growth, is it better or worse to have a larger federal bureaucracy?
Oh, goodness, no. Right now, we have a government that's draining the private sector of productive capital, and it's dragging down the U.S. economy. And until we reverse that, we are not going to have the growth that we really deserve and really need to get out of this debt crisis.
So as we look ahead and recognize the need to deal with mandatory spending, and I invite any one of my Democrat colleagues to sit down at a table and address mandatory spending rather than just giving speeches about it and giving commercials about it, but put that as a conversation that needs to be dealt with on a bipartisan basis. True or false, if we're going to address what we need to do to get economic growth and deal with spending in order to combat inflation, would it make sense for us to currently go back and restrain Leviathan and go reduce the size and scope of the overall federal bureaucracy and discretionary spending right now, and go take some of those dollars that have already been committed in some of the student loans, go take some of those dollars sitting over at Interior or EPA and other places where they're using that as regulations to strangle economic growth and opportunity, constrain that in order to get the American people freed up? Would that do more to deal with inflation by constraining spending, put us on a path to save $3 or $4 trillion over 10 years, and then create economic growth by getting Leviathan out of the way? I would ask you all to give quick answers on that because my time's just about out.
Yes, and one of the things I suggested is end the emergency and all subsidies and spending associated with the emergency, including student loan.
Amen. Agreed. And I would ask just Mr. Taylor, Mr. Hodge, to answer that real quick, and then I'll yield back.
No, I agree, you got it exactly right.
Yes, sir. I just returned from Europe, and the European countries are growing very slowly because of the size of their governments. And we're inching toward that level ourselves, and we're going to have the same economic outcome.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
I thank the gentleman from Texas and yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Ralph Norman from the Palmetto State.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for each of you. Sorry I had another meeting, so I hadn't heard all the discussion that's gone